There's a terrible lot of water running loose here, but I've seen the time and place where even what is in that drip would be worth a gold mine. That was in the emigrant days. They used to come over south of here through what they called Emigrant Pass on their way to California. I was a kid then, about 18-year-old, and what I didn't know about Injuns and agency cattle wasn't a patch of alkali. I had a kid outfit of bridle, lots of silver and such, and I used to ride over and be the handsome boy before such outfits as happened along. They were queer people, most of them from Missouri and such like southern seaports, and they were terrible sick of travel by the time they come in sight of Emigrant Pass. Up to Santa Fe they mostly hiked along any old way, but once there they herded up together in bunches of 20 wagons or so. Count of our old friends, Geronimo and Loco. A good many of them had horned cattle to their wagons, and they crawled along about 2 miles an hour. Hotter than hell with the blower on. Nothing to look at but a mountain a week way. Chuck full of alkali, plenty of sagebrush and rattlesnakes, but mighty little water. Why, you boys know that country down there. Between the Chiricahua Mountains and Emigrant Pass, it's maybe a 3 or 4 days' journey for these yere bull slingers. Mostly they filled up their bellies and their kegs, hoping to last through, but they sure found it drier than cork legs, and generally long before they hit the springs their tongues was hanging out a foot. You see, for all their plumb nerve in coming so far, the most of them didn't know sick 'em. They were plumb innocent in regard to saving their water, and Injuns and such, and the long-haired buckskin fakes they picked up at Santa Fe for guides wasn't much better. That was where Texas Pete made his killing. Texas Pete was a tough citizen from the Lone Star. He was about as broad as he was long and wore all sorts of big whiskers and black eyebrows. His heart was very bad. You never could tell where Texas Pete was going to jump next. He was a sidewinder and a diamondback and a little black rattlesnake all rolled into one. I believe that Texas Pete person cared about as little for killing a man as for taking a drink. And he surely drank without an effort. Peaceable citizens just spoke soft and minded their own business. On peaceable citizens, Texas Pete used to plant out in the sagebrush. Now this Texas Pete happened to discover a water hole right out in the plumb middle of the desert. He promptly annexed said water hole, digs her out, timbers her up, and lays for emigrants. He charged 2 bits a head, man or beast, and nobody got a mouthful till he paid up in hard coin. Think of the wads he raked in. I used to figure it up just for the joy of envying him, I reckon. An average 20-wagon outfit, first and last, would bring him in somewheres about $50. And besides, he had 40 rod at 4 bits a glass. And outfits at that time were thicker'n spatter. We used all to go down sometimes to watch them come in. When they see that little canvas shack and that well, they begun to cheer up and move fast. And when they see that sign, water, 2 bits a head, their eyes stuck out like 2 raw oysters. Then come the kicks. What a howl they did raise, surely. But it didn't do no manner of good. Texas Pete didn't do nothing but sit there and smoke, with a kind of sulky gleam in one corner of his eye. He didn't even take the trouble to answer, but his Winchester lay across his lap. There wasn't no humor in the situation for him. Emigrants would always ask if the sign was asking 2 bits a head for humans. Why, you could get whiskey for that. Can't blame them for raising their howl. Why, at that time the regular water holes was charging 5 cents a head from the government freighters, and the motto was always, "Hold up, Uncle Sam," at that. Once in a while some outfit would get mad and go charging off dry. But it was a long, long way to the springs, and mighty hot and dusty. Texas Pete and his one lonesome water hole surely did a big business. Late one afternoon, me and Gentleman Tim was jogging along above Texas Pete's place. It was a turble hot day. You had to prime yourself to spit. And we was just getting back from driving some beef up to the troops at Fort Huachuca. We was due to cross the emigrant trail. She's wore in turble deep. You can see the ruts today. When we top the rise, we see a little old outfit just making out to drag along. It was one little schooner all by herself, drug along by two poor old caballos that couldn't have pulled my hat off. Their tongues was out, and every once in a while they'd stick in a chuck hole. Then a man would get down and put his shoulder to the wheel, and everybody'd take a heave, and up they'd come, all a-trembling and weak. Tim and I rode down just to take a look at the curiosity. A thin-looking man was driving, all humped up, weary and dust-covered. I hailed him, inquiring if he feared Indians in these parts. He admitted he did, but explained he couldn't keep up with his group. When he asked about water, I reckoned he could find some nearby. He drove his wagon up to the water trough at Texas Pete's place. Gentleman Tim and I following along our usual trail. No sooner had he stopped than Texas Pete emerged, demanding 4 bits to water the horses. The traveler looked bewildered, confessing he had no money, having been robbed. Pete refused him water without payment. The man, appearing helpless, asked me the distance to the next water source. I informed him it was 20 miles off. He muttered to himself, then resignedly accepted the situation, commenting on the cool of the evening making the journey bearable. He called to someone named Sue inside the wagon for a cup. A pale-faced woman appeared, handing out a tin cup. Texas Pete, upon learning there were 3 travelers, raised his price to 6 bits. The man protested, explaining he wasn't asking water for his stock, but for his wife and baby, who had been without all day due to a broken cask. Pete remained unmoved, insisting on 2 bits a head. The woman emerged, cradling a small child with wispy yellow hair and a flushed face. She pleaded for water for her sick child, but Pete, seemingly in a foul mood, berated them for traveling without funds. The man offered trade goods in lieu of cash, but Pete refused, claiming he didn't run a store. Gentleman Tim and I found ourselves without funds to help. Tim attempted to vouch for the travelers, offering to pay later, but Pete demanded immediate payment. Tim and Pete exchanged harsh words, Tim calling Pete the meanest man he'd ever encountered, while Pete sneered at Tim's softness. The situation grew tense, with Pete handling his rifle menacingly, which the man had been standing there bewildered, the cup hanging from his finger. At last, looking pretty desperate, he stooped down to dig up a little of the wet from an overflow puddle lying at his feet. At the same time, the horses, left sort of to themselves and being drier than a covered bridge, drug forward and stuck their noses in the trough. Gentleman Tim and me was sitting there on our horses, a little to one side. We saw Texas Pete jump up from his chair, take a quick aim, and cut loose with his rifle. It was plumb unexpected to us. We hadn't thought of any shooting, and our 6 shooters was tied in. Count of the jumpy country we'd been driving the steers over, but Gentleman Tim, who had unslung his rope, aiming to help the horses out of the chuck hole, snatched her off the horn, and with one of the prettiest 20-foot flip throws I ever did see done, he snaked old Texas Pete right out of his wickiup, gun and all. The old renegade did his best to twist around for a shot at us, but it was no go. and I never enjoyed hog-tying a critter more in my life than I enjoyed hog-tying Texas Pete. Then we turned to see what damage had been done. We were some relieved to find the family all right, but Texas Pete had bored one of them poor old crow-bait hosses plumb through the head. Gentleman Tim spoke quietly and politely to Texas Pete, a tone I recognized as a warning sign from my years on the range with the Irishman. He then addressed the stranger, inviting him to provide water for his family and assuring him that Pete would compensate for any losses from his own corral. Tim had a way with words when he chose to use them. As the stranger began to respond, I guided him aside, cautioning him to let Tim be. I explained that Tim's manner of speech indicated anger, and it was best not to interfere when he was in such a state. The stranger seemed to understand, so we busied ourselves with building a fire and preparing food while Tim paced, looking formidable. After some time, Tim appeared to reach a decision. He untied Texas Pete and ordered him to stand, threatening to hand him over to Geronimo if he attempted escape or disobeyed. Tim then selected a shovel and pick, forcing Pete to carry them down the trail before setting him to digging. Pete began the task with vigor, Tim watching from horseback, his weapon and rope at the ready. The stranger and I observed silently. As Pete's pace slowed, he questioned whether he was digging his own grave. Tim, maintaining his eerily polite demeanor, explained that the hole was for the stranger's horse. Pete's protest was cut short by the cocking of Tim's gun. He resumed digging with renewed effort, clearly unnerved by Tim's calm demeanor. Once the hole reached about 4 or 5 feet deep, Tim dismounted and declared it sufficient. Tim then outlined his grim intentions: to bury the horse, shoot Pete, place him in the grave with the animal, and leave an epitaph as both comfort to honest travelers and warning to the dishonest. He offered Pete the chance to flee, stating his indifference to when the killing occurred. As Tim inspected the hole, his expression suddenly changed. He briskly ordered us all back to the shack. There, he hitched Pete's best team to the stranger's wagon, instructing the man to depart immediately, using a whiskey keg for water. We sat in silence after the wagon left. Abruptly, Tim announced a change of heart. He decided to leave Pete tied up, planning to return the next day to release him, suggesting that a night of discomfort and thirst might serve as a fitting punishment. We rode off just about sundown, leaving Texas Pete lashed tight. Now all this knocked me hell west and crooked, and I said so, but I couldn't get a word out of Gentleman Tim. All the answer I could get was just little laughs. We drawed into the ranch near midnight, but next morning Tim had a long talk with the boss, and the result was that the whole outfit was instructed to arm up with a pick or a shovel apiece and to get set for Texas Pete's. We got there a little after noon, turned the old boy out without firearms, and then began to dig at a place Tim told us to, near that grave of Texas Pete's. In 3 hours, we had the finest water hole developed you ever want to see. Then the boss stuck up a sign that said, "Public water hole, water free." Texas Pete could charge all he wanted on his own property, but Tim vowed if he ever heard of him laying claim to this other hole, he'd make him hard to catch. Then we rode off home. You see, when Gentleman Tim inspected that grave, he noted indications of water, and it struck him that running the old renegade out of business was a neater way of getting even than merely killing him. Somebody threw a fresh mesquite on the fire. The flames leaped up again, showing a thin trickle of water running down the other side of the cave. The steady downpour again made itself prominent through the reestablished silence. After that, Texas Pete put in a heap of his spare time in letting Tim alone.